How's it going, everyone? Every now and again, I like to cover a larger topic in the hobby, and lighting in particular is a loaded topic. Last week I did a short video on just how much of an effect our choice of lighting makes aesthetically, and in the comments people overwhelmingly asked for a deeper dive into the topic of lighting. So let's start with some basics, and then work our way to the different types of fixtures. So grab your favorite beverage because this one might take a little while. Lighting is important because it directly affects how we visually enjoy the hobby. But probably more importantly, the vast majority of the corals in our tanks are photosynthetic. Corals, as we know them, are a symbiotic relationship between the actual coral animal and dinoflagellates called zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae live in the tissue of the corals and are kind of like algae in that they contain chlorophyll for photosynthesis. The byproducts of photosynthesis are things like simple sugars that the coral hosts can then use as an energy source. The color of zooxanthellae is basically varying degrees of brown, but there are over 80 known varieties of zooxanthellae, which can give coral a different look. Corals occasionally expel zooxanthellae to control both the amount of dinoflagellates and the varieties residing in its tissue. This is easiest to see in LPS, where one might see brown stringy material getting spit out. This is usually done to adjust for some change in the environment or a stress reaction. The color of light is important not only for aesthetics, but for the photosynthetic process itself. Chlorophyll in zooxanthellae does not absorb light uniformly. There are certain spectrums of light that are absorbed highly and other spectrums that are rejected. The type of chlorophyll most commonly found in corals is chlorophyll A, and it has two major absorption peaks. One at the 440 nanometer wavelength, which is kind of like a violet colored light, and the other at the 675 nanometer wavelength, which is a red light. Light spectrums neighboring those spectral peaks are also absorbed by chlorophyll A, but also by different compounds such as chlorophyll C and carotenoids, so it's important for whatever lighting you choose to have a very robust spectrum outside of just those two peaks, the 675 nanometer and the 440 nanometer. The color of light is measured by a Kelvin rating. If you recall from high school physics and chemistry, kelvins is basically Celsius, but starts at absolute zero rather than the freezing point of water. So 0 degrees Kelvin is equivalent to negative 273.15 degrees Celsius. Anyhow, once you start turning up the temperature, imagine a theoretical black body of mass. Once it gets warmer, it'll start to actually glow. I guess the best way to visualize this is to imagine a star. Our sun burns at just under 6,000 Kelvin, and we get that yellow light as a result. Once you get to about 8,000 Kelvin to, let's say, 10,000 Kelvin in temperature, the black body radiates white light. Between 15,000 Kelvin to 25,000 Kelvin, the radiation appears blue. So just to clarify, the bulbs in your tank that are 10,000 Kelvin are not burning at that temperature, they just have a similar color as a star that's actually burning that hot. A common misconception about higher Kelvin light bulbs is that they don't necessarily have more blue than lower Kelvin bulbs that appear more yellow. The blue light in these bulbs is achieved by reducing the reds, the greens, and yellows. It's entirely possible for a 6500 Kelvin yellow-looking bulb to have a great deal more blue spectrum available for photosynthesis than a 20,000 Kelvin bulb. Still, there are perks to using higher Kelvin bulbs. Bluer light is aesthetically pleasing, but also has the side perk of algae control, as algae tends to rely more on those reds, yellows, and greens compared to coral. Having said that, lower Kelvin bulbs grow coral faster in my experience. Possibly the best bulb I've ever seen at growing corals was the 6500 Kelvin Iwasaki metal halide. although it was arguably the least attractive color unless you're looking for a very yellow-looking, shallow water reef. Okay, let's talk a little bit about light intensity. When I started into reef keeping, the rule was get the brightest lighting possible. End of story. The most I've ever had on a tank was 2 400-watt metal halides in addition to 4 110-watt VHO fluorescents. And this was all over a 75-gallon tank. Needless to say, it was very bright and very warm. Fast forward about 20-something years, and I have some corals now in extremely dimly lit tanks, and they're doing just fine. So in the bright tank example, the intensity was probably close to 1200 par, if not more really. And in my low light setup, the par was about 50. In both cases, coral grew just fine. In fact, with the exception of Acropora, the vast majority of the corals we keep here do quite well in low light. What seems to be much more important than raw intensity is just consistency. I get asked fairly often, what light is the best light? And unfortunately, there is no right answer. First off, there's the difference in aesthetics, and that's purely a subjective decision that only the hobbyists can make for themselves. In terms of coral biology, what type of lighting that will work best for your tank will depend a great deal on what types of animals you intend to keep. As I mentioned before, corals will adapt to lighting by regulating their zooxanthellae, so most corals will grow under any of these lighting technologies. Having said that, it's entirely possible to have some corals take on a desirable appearance while other corals become less attractive under the very same light. As far as the type of technology to use, it will depend on what aspects of the technology are most important to you. There are pros and cons to any type of lighting, whether it's LED, T5, metal halide, or even natural sunlight. Depending on your situation, the drawbacks of one technology might not matter to you. Conversely, the benefits of another technology might not be meaningful to you at all. For example, I don't care about controllability, so the attraction to LED isn't really there for me. Anyway, before I get ahead of myself, let's talk a bit about each one in turn, starting with the most popular. Alright, let's start with light-emitting diodes, LEDs. LED fixtures are nice because they offer the most in terms of control. It's possible to control each LED individually, so the hobbyist can customize the schedule, the colors, and intensity. Of all the types of lighting, I think LEDs do the best job of showcasing corals by bringing out the most appealing fluorescence. They are energy efficient, and the LEDs themselves are long-lasting. Lastly, the fixtures tend to run cooler than T5 fluorescents or metal halides, which is a big deal for a lot of hobbyists in warmer climates that have to battle to cool their tanks. It is far more difficult to cool water down than it is to heat it up. The downside to LEDs is that some corals do not color up as well under LED as they would under other types of light. In particular, SPS and certain LPS such as Acanthastria and Micromusa definitely don't. I use a lot of LED in my greenhouse currently, mainly to conserve energy, but I prefer both T5 and metal halide when it comes to growth and developing color. Some aquarists have issues with the spotlight nature of LEDs, where dark shadow areas on the underside of corals can cause the colony to die off. Also, while the LEDs last a long time, the longevity of the fixture itself can be substantially shorter than the rated life of the LED because of the other electronic components that might fail. The last downside to LED, it's not going to affect too many people, but for those interested in photography, LED is the worst light ever invented. For better or worse, LED are quickly becoming the most popular form of lighting in the hobby, if it isn't already actually. Compared to the other types, it's the newest technology and could see some major improvements down the line that pretty much eliminate many of those drawbacks that I listed. Let's move on to T5 fluorescents. T5 fluorescent bulbs are thin glass tubes that produce a very robust light spectrum, and in my experience, they color up corals quite nicely. Almost every insanely colored SPS aquarium that simply blew me away implemented this variety of lighting. There are a lot of bulb choices available, which can give your tank pretty much any type of aesthetic. I say pretty much because that neon disco look that an all blue LED light gives, that's pretty unique. Now, while they're not as controllable to the extent that LEDs are, there are some fixtures out there that can dim T5 bulbs to give that dawn-dusk lighting effect, although I don't know if that reduces the life of the bulbs. Lastly, because the light emitted by a T5 bulb is spread out evenly over the length of the bulb, there's almost no trace of those shadowing effects that plague point light sources. No lighting system is perfect, however, and the T5 fixtures do have their drawbacks. First off, the bulb life is frustratingly short. They begin to erode both in terms of spectrum and light intensity right around 6 months, and by 12 months they're a drastically different bulb. Here at the greenhouse, I run them a lot longer than that just because they're supplemental to the sunlight that we receive. But when I do finally get around to swapping out the bulbs, the difference is staggering. The second downside is the energy efficiency. While not horrible on a per bulb basis, it's really not as good as LED lights. Depending on the number of bulbs in the fixture, it can get expensive to operate. For example, if you have an 8 bulb fixture, the electrical consumption along with the cost of bulb replacements might make for possibly the most expensive lighting upkeep of all of the technologies. Lastly, the bulbs themselves are fragile, and they can easily break during shipping, especially when you consider the longer bulb lengths of 48 inches and 60 inches. Okay, metal halide lights. Finally, we get to metal halide, which I would venture to guess is the least popular form of lighting at the hobbyist level, and possibly the most popular lighting at the commercial level. The positive aspects of metal halide are its intensity, spectrum, and longevity. Metal halide bulbs are a point light source, like LEDs, but even more concentrated. When shining down into a tank, they create a very pleasing shimmering effect, which is almost absent under the diffused light of a T5 fluorescent bulb. Those shimmer lines closely replicate what's seen in nature, and there was a study done several years back that indicated corals actually benefited from them. The major problem with metal halide is energy consumption and heat. Metal halide bulbs consume a ton of electricity, and it will be noticeable on your monthly electric bill if you just installed a new halide fixture. The heat generated by metal halides is also something that has to be dealt with. In large aquariums situated in a large room, some well-placed cooling fans might do the trick. On smaller aquariums or in tight quarters where heat tends to build up, one might need to install a chiller or crank up the air conditioning to compensate. Either way, heat management will further increase that electricity bill. In terms of controllability, it's practically absent from these bulbs. They can turn on and off. In some ways, they don't even do that particularly well because some require a cooling off period before being able to turn back on. There are dimmable metal halides, but from everything I've read, it's not great for the bulbs, and some bulbs will shift colors as a result. Now that we've gone over the types of lighting, hopefully you can see that all of them have their pros and cons. What will make for the best light in your tank will depend in large part on the factors that are important to you. I can say up front that most corals can be kept under just about any kind of light fixture you choose. The list of corals that demand extremely intense light is surprisingly short. Picking what light to go with can be a daunting task, but the obvious solution to deciding on a fixture is to not really decide on anything. You could get a light that incorporates more than one technology. Hybrid lighting systems exist that combine either LED and T5, or metal halide and T5, or metal halide and LED. There might even be some systems out there that are a combination of all three, I don't know. So if you really need the best of all worlds, I'm sure there's a fixture out there for you. That fixture might be shockingly expensive, so I can give you one cost-saving tip. Let's say you have some LED fixture that you're happy with, but want to supplement it with T5, but you don't like the look of T5 bulbs. What you could do is purchase an inexpensive T5 fixture with all white bulbs and only run it for about 4 to 6 hours while you're away from the tank. That way, the corals still benefit from the light and color up nicely, but it doesn't interfere with the aesthetic of the LEDs when you return home. Then there's natural light. Tidal Gardens uses a mix of natural light from the greenhouse structure and supplemental light from mainly T5s and LEDs. The idea when the greenhouse was constructed back in 2002 was that the sun is the perfect light on the perfect timer, and the corals grown under this light would be the healthiest specimens for the lowest electrical cost. This premise still might be true, but not necessarily in Ohio where the greenhouse is located. The difference in lighting from season to season has a drastic effect on the corals, and really some species don't like it at all. One might guess that it's because of the cold, dark Ohio winters that are the problem, but it's actually the summers. The winter months, it turns out, are some of the best for growing just about every coral. If I had to guess, it has to do with both the change in light intensity as well as the photo period. In the summer, it feels like the sun is in the sky twice as long, and that is just not a good thing. The shorter photo period of the winter months has proven to be a much better situation for the corals here. Setups that are designed to use natural light would be the most successful in areas that have the most consistent climates, but preferably not in crazy hot climates because it's far more difficult to chill water than it is to heat it up, especially in large quantities like this. So that pretty much does it for lighting. Clear as mud, right? Hopefully it helps you decide on what type of lighting you want over your reef. If you like this kind of content, give this video a like. It helps me figure out the sorts of things that my viewers are interested in. Thanks again for watching.